The film begins with a sequence of suitcases being packed, accompanied by a song playing in the background. The song talks about trying new adventures when you're young and creating memories. Then the scene transitions to a teenage boy named Will Hawkins. He is running from the police after stealing a cop car. Due to his actions, the police put handcuffs on him. Later, he is taken to Social Protection Services where he faces juvenile. An officer named Mark questions Will about his behavior as he has changed schools 7 times and lived in 22 homes over the past 6 years. This leaves them with no option but to send him to juvenile. Hearing this, Will gets worried and begs the officer not to send him there. Furthermore, he promises to change himself this time. The officer admits that Will has gone through a lot after losing his parents. However, he tells him that there is no other option left. Then he assures him that it's for his betterment. After a while, a secretary comes to the office and tells the officer that a woman wants to speak to him. Thus, the officer goes outside. Meanwhile, Will look at the picture of his parents and reminisce about memories from his childhood. Soon after, the officer comes back and introduces one of their foster parents named Kristen to Will. A vibrant woman tells Will that she is excited to have him this year. Her son named George also accompanies her and greets Will warmly. However, Will remains confused about the situation. Then the officer tells Will that he is going to summer camp for a week. However, Will refuses without any second thought. Smiles on Kristen and George's faces fade away. Meanwhile, the officer explains that if Will declines, he will have to face juvenile detention. Listening to this, Will swiftly changes his decision and agrees to attend the summer camp. George gets excited and tells Will about the various activities he can enjoy at the summer camp. Afterwards, Will starts singing about his life challenges, and Kristen joins him. The scene transitions to all of them on a bus with many teenagers, heading towards the summer camp. On the way, they dance and sing songs about adventures and discovering new horizons. Upon arriving at the camp, everyone welcomes them with cheering, dancing, and joyful singing. Although Will appears confused, he genuinely feels uplifted by the atmosphere. His attention is drawn to a young, beautiful girl dancing in the crowd. Instantly, he feels a strong attraction towards her and approaches her. They begin dancing together, indulging in the moment. Then, Will introduces himself and learns that her name is Avery. Their interaction is interrupted by Sean, a camp boy who often brags about himself. Seeing a new arrival, Sean inquires about Will's name and asks how he knows George. In an attempt to fit in, Will fabricates a story, claiming that George is his cousin. The group eventually returns to dancing and singing, with Will observing from the sidelines. Additionally, Will realizes that it's a church camp. In the office, Kristen meets the owner of the camp, David. After examining Will's file, David finds that Will tried to sell his high school and was involved in numerous misconducts. This revelation raises concerns for David. However, Kristen playfully mentions that David himself was a mischievous boy in the past. She reassures David that Will won't cause any trouble this time. Then they decide to place him in a cabin with George. Later, George and Will arrive in their cabin. The cabin is filled with stuffed animals and old wooden decor. Will feels disgusted by the place and questions George's choice. However, George assures him that it's a cool place. Then George asks Will about lying to Sean and expresses that he doesn't like to get involved in a lie. But Will ignores him and looks outside the cabin window. There he sees Avery with her friend. This makes him realize why George chose this cabin because of the girl. At first, George hesitates but admits that he has a crush on Avery's roommate named Presley. Then Will asks about Avery. George laughs at Will and tells him that there is no chance for him to get her, as she is the perfect type of girl who will never like a troublesome boy like Will. However, Will doesn't give up and decides to know more about Avery. George tells him that Avery lives at the camp because her father owns this place. Moreover, Avery is a camp counselor and is quite competitive. Then Will asks George to help him hide his secret from Avery, and in return, he will help him with Elizabeth. Eventually, George agrees to Will's request. In the afternoon, they head to the registration stalls for various activities. Avery and Elizabeth are spotted, so Will and George approach them. While talking with the girls, Will enrolls himself and George in the paintball activity. They discuss the different teams. Will attempts to engage George in a conversation with Presley. Unfortunately, George becomes extremely flustered and doesn't speak to her directly. It's evident that Presley also has a likeness for George and tries to initiate a conversation with him. However, the situation turns awkward, prompting Will and George to walk away. Once they leave, Avery playfully teases Presley, suggesting that George has feelings for her as well. But Presley responds by saying that he doesn't even look at her. Meanwhile, Will encourages George to at least talk to Presley. Once, George admits feeling insecure in front of her, leading to a loss of self-confidence. Then he reveals that he has written many letters but has never given them to her. Despite this, Will tries to boost George's confidence and urges him to talk to her directly. Then, George starts singing about not feeling good enough. On the other side, Presley also sings about her feelings. Meanwhile, Avery and Will join in, attempting to convince them that they are perfect for each other. When the song ends, Will and George encounter Sean, who informs them that he plans to defeat them in this year's camp competition. He boasts about his consistent victories in the competition every year. Then Sean gives an offer to Will to join his team called Azure Apostle. However, Will declines the offer and leaves a sarcastic remark about their team's shirt. Sean quickly lets Will know that the decision regarding teams will be made during a ceremony and that he can't decide on his own. During the night, the ceremony starts. David instructs the newcomers to stand up. There are 3 teams in total: Verd Maximus, Azure Apostle, and Crimson Angels. David tells Will to join George's team, Verd Maximus, which brings a smile to Will's face. The following day, David announces the beginning of the camp competition over the speaker. George gets up and asks Will to wake up. However, Will appears slightly frustrated and expresses his desire to leave. However, he acknowledges that doing so would likely lead him into juvenile detention. Meanwhile, George attempts to lift Will's spirits by emphasizing how much he's needed for the talent show. Additionally, George points out that this week offers a chance to try something new, encouraging Will not to miss out on the opportunity. Eventually, Will agrees to stay at the camp. In the cafeteria, as Will and George are eating their food, Sean interrupts everyone by pulling up a chair at a table and starts yelling 5 minutes. The whole cafeteria joins in, repeating the same words. Will is confused by the situation. Then Sean asks Will to take a seat on the chair, and he agrees. Then Sean explains that this is a game called 5 Minutes. In this game, they ask questions from the most mysterious newcomer at the camp. During the game, they ask Will about his favorite color, film, and various other things. Fortunately, Will answers all the questions in a cool way, impressing everyone. After the game, David calls Will over to talk to him. Initially, Will becomes concerned, thinking he might have done something wrong. However, David reassures him to calm down, explaining that it's nothing of that sort. David expresses his happiness about having Will at the camp. During their conversation, Will inquires about the meaning behind the camp's name, Week Away. David explains that it signifies a week away from their regular lives, which can eventually lead to a positive change in their personalities. After a while, George and the rest of the squad come outside the cafeteria. They begin talking about the Warrior games. Sean mentions that Avery loves the blob game, and Will says he also likes it to impress her. Then Avery challenges Will to defeat her, and Will accepts the challenge. Later, Will and George go to the practice area, and Will realizes that the blob game involves jumping from a height. Initially, he gets scared but overcomes his fear by jumping, and then he sings a song to express his feelings. Afterwards, the dodgeball competition begins, and Avery from Crimson Angels faces off against Sean's Azure Apostles. In the middle of the match, Presley gets hit by a ball, despite George's failed attempt to save her. Later, Presley applies an ice bag to her eye, and Avery tried to console her. Meanwhile, Will suggests George talk with Presley. However, George ends up rushing to the bathroom, and Will follows him. Will then gives George a makeover to boost his confidence. Afterwards, George daydreams about confessing his feelings to Presley by singing. Early in the morning, Will plays the guitar by the lakeside. Suddenly, Avery also arrives, surprised to see Will there. Will asks Avery why she's there, and she guides him to a beautiful place in the woods. She explains that she comes to this place every year, as it's her favorite. She reveals that her father created the spot for her mother when she was ill. Despite it being 11 years, she still feels her mother's presence and misses her deeply. Will comments that Avery is perfect, but she takes issue with the word. Then Avery clarifies that perfection doesn't exist in the world, and everyone makes mistakes at some point in their lives. They proceed to sing a song and dance together until dawn. Suddenly, they hear a siren and rush to check. Outside the camp, David announces the start of the paintball game. All the teams dress up to participate in the competition. As the competition begins, they all have a lot of fun while shooting at each other. Avery and Will come across and make a deal to attack Sean's team together as they are the strongest. After an interesting game, Avery and Will knock down Sean's team. Eventually, Avery also shoots Will with her paintball gun, and Crimson Angels win the competition. This irritates Sean as he never thinks of losing to anyone. At night, everyone gathers around the bonfire, sharing their life experiences. Avery stands up and speaks about how God always has a plan to bring prosperity into our lives. She then begins to sing a song praising God, and the whole group joins in. The atmosphere deeply moves Will, prompting him to also sing along with them. After the bonfire, Avery and Will move towards their cabin. There, Avery gives him a photo of her along with him, George, and Presley as a memory. Meanwhile, Will tries to confess his true feelings to her but doesn't find the courage. Afterwards, they both say goodbye to each other and head towards their cabin. In the cabin, Will shows the picture to George and Kristen. Then Kristen sees the picture of Will's parents and tells him that he looks like his father. She tries to cheer up Will by saying that his father must be proud of him. In the middle of the night, Sean breaks into David's office and takes Will's file. The next morning, George and Will are discussing preparations for the talent show with their team. Meanwhile, Sean interrupts them and requests to have a conversation with Will. Will assumes that Sean might still be upset about the paintball competition. However, Sean surprises Will by stating that he can't change who he is. This alarms Will, prompting him to question Sean's intentions. Gradually, Sean reveals that he's aware of Will's fraudulent actions and lies. He urges Will to tell the truth about everything to Avery. This shocks Will, causing him to rush back to his cabin. There, Will decides to leave the camp out of fear of facing Avery. Meanwhile, George runs to Avery and Presley, inquiring about Will. Unfortunately, they have no information about Will. Then George explains that Will seemed lost after his conversation with Sean. Eventually, they all realize that Will has left the camp without informing anyone. Thus they approach Sean to find out, and he tells everything about Will to Avery. Meanwhile, Will walks down the road to catch a lift. Later, Avery asks her father for the car keys and drives down the road to find Will. Luckily, she spots Will on the roadside and gets out of her car. She attempts to convince Will to let her help, but he is overwhelmed with emotions and starts shouting at Avery. He tells her that she doesn't know anything about him, and doesn't care. Avery tries to convince him that she cares, but Will insists that nobody loves him, not even God, otherwise God wouldn't leave him alone. This leads to an argument between them, and Will angrily admits that he doesn't feel anything for her. Avery's heart breaks, and she returns to the camp after calling him a liar. Then, Will sings a heartbreak song, realizing that there are people who care about him. Thus he rushes back to the camp. The talent competition begins, and Avery informs George that Will won't be returning. Feeling hopeless, George takes the stage to sing along. Meanwhile, Will comes from behind and tells Avery that he lied about not having feelings for her. This revelation brings happiness to Avery, and they share a passionate kiss. Afterwards, Will rushes to the stage, and George is happy and surprised to see him again. In the end, Bird Maximus wins the competition, and everyone celebrates. The next day, Sean congratulates Will for his victory and apologizes for his past behavior. Then Sean jokes about beating Will in the competition next year. After that, Will goes to talk with Avery about his plans. Meanwhile, George finally talks with Presley and hands her all the letters he wrote for her. Presley kisses George on the cheek and gives him her number. In the ending scene, as Will is about to leave the camp, Kristen asks Will to live with her and George like a family. Overwhelmed with emotions, they all share a heartfelt hug, and Will comes to realize that there are people who truly love and care about him.